Delta Flight 1247 cruised at 35,000 feet above the American heartland. Blood dripped from a 14-year-old boy's face onto the cabin carpet. 200 passengers held their breath. But nobody knew that the next moment would change everything in a way no one could have ever imagined. Before we begin this powerful story, I want to know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you believe every child deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their skin color, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Now, let us dive into what happened on that fateful flight. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of a modest apartment in southeast Atlanta, Georgia, casting golden stripes across the worn but meticulously clean carpet. Lorraine Carter stood in the small kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she folded her son's clothes into a carry-on bag. She had checked the weather in Seattle 3 times already, packed and repacked his sweater twice, and changed the snacks in his backpack from chips to fruit bars and back to chips again. She was stalling, and she knew it. Today was the day her 14-year-old son Jamal would fly alone for the first time in his life, and she could barely contain the anxiety that churned in her stomach like a storm. Jamal emerged from his tiny bedroom, dressed in his best jeans and a crisp blue button-down shirt that Lorraine had ironed the night before. He looked older somehow, more mature than his 14 years. Perhaps it was the determination in his dark eyes, or the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity that reminded Lorraine so much of her own father. In his hands, he cradled a black violin case, the leather worn at the edges from years of use. That violin was the only thing his father Derek had left behind when he walked out of their lives 10 years ago, and Jamal had taught himself to play it with a passion that often brought tears to Lorraine's eyes. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms and a bathroom crammed into 700 square feet, but Lorraine had made it a home. Photographs lined the walls, mostly of Jamal at various ages, from his gap-toothed kindergarten portrait to his recent 8th grade graduation. There were no pictures of Derek. Lorraine had removed them years ago, unable to look at the face of the man who had abandoned them without explanation. But now, after 10 long years of silence, Derek had reached out. He wanted to reconnect with his son. He wanted to make amends. And despite every instinct telling her to protect Jamal from potential heartbreak, Lorraine had agreed to let him go. Lorraine set down the bag and turned to face her son. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she cupped his face in her hands, studying every feature as if memorizing it for a long journey. Jamal was growing into a handsome young man, with his father's strong jaw and his mother's gentle eyes. But more than his appearance, it was his character that made Lorraine proud. Despite everything they had been through, despite the poverty and the struggles and the absence of a father figure, Jamal had grown into a kind, respectful, and ambitious young man. She took a deep breath and began the conversation she had been dreading. Her voice was soft but serious as she said that she needed him to understand something before he got on that plane. She explained that he was a black boy traveling alone, and that some people would look at him differently because of that. She told him not to draw attention to himself, not to do anything that might make people suspicious, and not to give anyone a reason to question him. She knew it was not fair, she admitted, but it was the reality they lived in. Jamal's brow furrowed with confusion and a hint of frustration. He asked why he had to be more careful than other kids, why he could not just be a normal teenager taking a flight to see his dad. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of generations of injustice. Lorraine's heart ached as she searched for the right words. She sat down on the edge of the couch and patted the cushion beside her, inviting Jamal to sit. She told him about his grandfather, her daddy, who grew up in Mississippi during the Jim Crow era. She recounted how when he was about Jamal's age, he drank from a water fountain at the general store, not realizing it was the one marked for whites only. 3 men beat him so badly he lost the hearing in his left ear. All because he was thirsty on a hot day. She continued, explaining that things had changed since then, that there were laws now to protect people, but the hate had not gone away entirely. It had just learned to hide better, to wear suits and smile while it discriminated. She told Jamal that she was not trying to scare him, but that she needed him to be aware, to be smart, and to come back to her safe. Jamal listened quietly, absorbing his mother's words. He understood more than she probably realized. He had felt the suspicious eyes of store clerks following him through aisles. He had been stopped by school security more times than his white classmates. He knew what it felt like to be judged before he even opened his mouth. He reached out and took his mother's hand, promising her that he would be careful and that he would make her proud. An hour later, they arrived at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. The terminal was a cacophony of sounds, rolling suitcases clicking against tile floors, announcements echoing through the high ceilings, children crying, couples arguing, and business travelers barking into phones. Jamal walked through the crowd with his carry-on bag over one shoulder and his violin case clutched protectively in his other hand. Lorraine had accompanied him as far as security would allow, and now it was time for him to continue alone. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, a maze of barriers and conveyor belts and stern-faced agents in blue uniforms. Jamal got in line behind a white family with 3 young children who were making a game of who could take off their shoes the fastest. When it was finally his turn, he placed his bag and violin on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector without incident. But as he moved to collect his belongings, a security agent motioned him aside. The agent, a burly man with a graying mustache, asked Jamal where he was headed. His tone was not unfriendly, but there was a suspicion in his eyes that made Jamal uncomfortable. Jamal replied politely that he was going to Seattle to visit his father. The agent then asked if he was traveling alone, and when Jamal confirmed that he was, the agent asked how old he was. When Jamal said 14, the agent asked to see his ticket. Jamal fumbled for his boarding pass, his hands suddenly clumsy under the agent's scrutiny. He noticed that the white family had already collected their things and moved on without any additional questioning. He noticed that another black teenager a few positions back was also being pulled aside. He felt the familiar sting of injustice but kept his face neutral, remembering his mother's words. The agent examined his ticket, asked a few more questions about who bought it and why he was traveling alone, then finally waved him through with a curt nod. Jamal collected his belongings and walked quickly toward his gate, his heart pounding in his chest. He was not sure if he was angry or just tired. Maybe both. He found a seat near gate B-17 and looked up at the departure board. Delta Flight 1247 to Seattle was on time, departing in 2 hours. He pulled out his phone and texted his mother to let her know he had made it through security. She responded immediately with a string of heart emojis and a reminder to text when he boarded and landed. He smiled despite his earlier frustration. No matter what challenges the world threw at him, he always had his mother in his corner. As he sat there waiting, Jamal opened the violin case and looked at the instrument inside. It was not expensive or particularly beautiful, just a standard student model that his father had bought at a pawn shop years ago. But to Jamal, it was priceless. It was his connection to a man he barely remembered, his escape from the hardships of daily life, and his dream of a better future. He had practiced for hours every day, watching YouTube tutorials and mimicking the techniques of the great violinists. His music teacher at school said he had a gift, that with proper training he could go far. Jamal hoped that was true. He hoped that somehow, his talent would be his ticket out of poverty, out of prejudice, out of all the limitations that society tried to place on young black men like him. He closed the case and looked out the window at the planes taxiing on the runway. In a few hours, he would be in Seattle. He would meet the father who had abandoned him. He did not know what to expect or how to feel. Part of him wanted answers, wanted to confront Derek and demand to know why he left. Part of him just wanted a dad, wanted to feel what it was like to have a father who showed up to his recitals and taught him to ride a bike and did all the things fathers were supposed to do. And part of him was terrified that this meeting would end in disappointment, that Derek would turn out to be exactly the kind of man who would abandon his family. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, snapping Jamal out of his thoughts. He gathered his things and joined the line of passengers filing onto the jetway. As he stepped through the door of the aircraft and entered the narrow aisle, he had no idea that the next 5 hours would change his life forever. Jamal made his way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, carefully navigating past passengers who were struggling to cram oversized bags into overhead compartments and others who had stopped abruptly to check their boarding passes. The air inside the cabin was a mixture of recycled oxygen and the faint chemical smell of industrial cleaning products. Flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, directing passengers and answering questions with professional smiles. Jamal counted the row numbers until he reached row 24, where he found his assigned seat, 24B, the middle seat in a row of 3 on the right side of the aircraft. The window seat, 24A, was already occupied. A man in his early 50s sat rigidly, his posture radiating an air of self-importance that seemed to fill the entire row. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than Lorraine's monthly rent, a crisp white shirt with gold cufflinks, and a silk tie in a deep burgundy. On his wrist glinted a Rolex watch, its face catching the overhead light with every slight movement. His hair was silver at the temples, swept back in a style that suggested regular visits to an expensive barber. In his hands, he held a copy of the Wall Street Journal, the pages crisp and unfolded with the precision of someone who considered reading the news a ritual of status. This was Gregory Whitmore, though Jamal did not know his name yet. He only knew the expression on the man's face when he looked up and saw a young black teenager approaching. It was a look Jamal had seen before, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, an almost imperceptible recoil as if proximity to Jamal was somehow offensive. The man did not say anything, but his silence spoke volumes. Jamal excused himself politely and gestured toward the middle seat, explaining that it was his assigned seat. Gregory did not respond verbally. He simply sighed heavily, a theatrical exhalation of displeasure, and shifted his legs slightly to allow Jamal to pass. As Jamal maneuvered into the cramped space, careful not to bump the man's expensive suit, Gregory pulled his arm closer to his body and adjusted his tie as if warding off contamination. Before sitting down, Jamal reached up to store his violin case in the overhead bin. He handled the case with obvious care and reverence, adjusting it so it would not be crushed by other luggage. Gregory watched this process with undisguised disdain, his lip curling slightly as if the sight of a young black boy with a violin was somehow personally insulting to him. Jamal settled into his seat and buckled his seatbelt. He could feel the tension radiating from the man beside him, but he tried to ignore it. He had dealt with people like this before. The best strategy, his mother had taught him, was to be polite, keep to yourself, and not give anyone a reason to cause trouble. So he pulled out his earbuds, connected them to his phone, and prepared to spend the flight listening to music and thinking about what he would say to his father. But Gregory Whitmore was not content to simply ignore his seatmate. A few minutes after Jamal sat down, Gregory pressed the call button above his head with an aggressive jab. A flight attendant appeared promptly, a professional woman in her mid-40s with auburn hair pinned back neatly and a name tag that read Diana Prescott, lead flight attendant. Gregory wasted no time on pleasantries. He told Diana that he needed to be moved to a different seat, stating that he was not comfortable with the current arrangement. Diana maintained her professional composure and asked if there was a problem with the seat itself. Gregory hesitated, glancing at Jamal, then said he would prefer not to elaborate but would appreciate being relocated as soon as possible. Diana checked her tablet and informed Gregory that unfortunately the flight was completely full. There were no available seats in any cabin. She apologized for the inconvenience and asked if there was anything else she could do to make his flight more comfortable. Gregory's face reddened with suppressed anger. He thanked Diana with a curtness that made the word sound more like a dismissal than gratitude. As she walked away, he muttered something under his breath that Jamal could not quite hear but could easily imagine. The tension in the row was palpable. Jamal kept his eyes forward, focusing on the seat back in front of him, willing himself to become invisible. But Gregory seemed determined to make his displeasure known. He spread his newspaper wider than necessary, the pages encroaching on Jamal's personal space. He positioned his elbow firmly on the shared armrest, pushing Jamal toward the other side. When Jamal reflexively shifted to give him more room, Gregory expanded to fill the newly available space. It was a petty power play, the kind of territorial aggression that Jamal recognized from school bullies. But there was something more sinister about it coming from a grown man in an expensive suit. It was not just about the armrest. It was about control, about establishing dominance, about making Jamal feel small and unwelcome in a space he had every right to occupy. A few minutes later, the third passenger in their row arrived. She was a pleasant-looking white woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her name was Barbara Simmons, and she taught third grade at an elementary school in Portland. She smiled warmly at Jamal as she settled into seat 24C, the aisle seat, and commented on what a nice polite young man he seemed to be. Jamal returned the smile, grateful for a moment of kindness. Barbara noticed his violin case in the overhead bin and asked if he played. Jamal's face lit up as he explained that yes, he had been playing for about 4 years now, mostly self-taught from YouTube videos but also with some help from his school music teacher. He was on his way to Seattle to visit his father, he added, and he was hoping to maybe play something for him. Gregory inserted himself into the conversation with a sneer. He asked mockingly if Jamal's father was in prison or if he had just run away. The question was delivered with a casualness that made it even more cruel, as if Gregory was commenting on the weather rather than insulting a child's family. Jamal felt the words like a physical blow, but he kept his composure. He replied politely that no sir, his father worked in Seattle, he was a mechanic. Gregory made a dismissive sound in his throat and muttered something about people like you that he did not bother to finish. The implication was clear enough. Barbara's expression shifted from friendly to uncomfortable. She shot a disapproving look at Gregory but said nothing, apparently unwilling to confront a stranger over his rudeness. It was a reaction Jamal had seen many times before, the discomfort of witnesses who recognized injustice but chose the safety of silence over the risk of intervention. The cabin crew completed their safety demonstration, and the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Jamal looked out the window past Gregory's rigid shoulder and watched Atlanta grow smaller beneath them. Somewhere down there, his mother was probably still standing in the parking garage, watching planes take off and praying for her son's safe return. Jamal made a silent promise to himself that he would not let her down. He would stay calm, stay polite, and make it to Seattle without incident. The plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the clouds. Jamal settled back in his seat and closed his eyes, letting the rumble of the engines drown out the hostile presence beside him. He told himself that it was only 5 hours. 5 hours and he would be in Seattle. 5 hours and he would finally see his father. He could endure anything for 5 hours. He did not know then how wrong he was. He did not know that those 5 hours would contain more pain, more fear, and more profound change than the entire 14 years of his life before them. The plane had been in the air for approximately 90 minutes when the first real incident occurred. The flight attendants were making their way down the aisle with the beverage cart, offering passengers their choice of drinks and the small bags of pretzels or cookies that passed for airline snacks. When the cart reached row 24, Diana Prescott smiled professionally and asked what everyone would like. Barbara ordered a ginger ale. Gregory demanded a scotch on the rocks in a tone that suggested he was accustomed to being served. Jamal politely requested an orange juice. Diana poured the drinks with practiced efficiency and handed them across. As Jamal reached for his orange juice, the plane encountered a small pocket of turbulence. The aircraft shuddered almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to jostle Jamal's arm at precisely the wrong moment. A few drops of orange juice splashed onto the sleeve of Gregory's expensive suit jacket. It was perhaps a teaspoon of liquid at most, a minor inconvenience that would have been easily forgiven between reasonable adults. But Gregory reacted as if Jamal had thrown an entire bucket of paint on him. He erupted from his seat with a roar of outrage, shouting that Jamal was a clumsy uneducated idiot and demanding to know if he had any idea how much the jacket cost. His face turned an alarming shade of purple as he jabbed a finger at the tiny wet spot on his sleeve. Other passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, their conversations dying away as the commotion drew their attention. Jamal immediately began apologizing, his voice sincere and contrite. He was so sorry, he said, it was the turbulence, he did not mean to. He grabbed napkins from his tray table and offered to help clean the spill. But when his hand moved toward Gregory's sleeve, the older man recoiled violently and shouted at Jamal not to touch him. Diana rushed back to intervene, her professional calm barely masking her concern. She offered Gregory extra napkins and a stain treatment wipe from the service kit, assuring him that the small spill would come right out. But Gregory was not interested in solutions. He was interested in being aggrieved. He demanded that Jamal pay for the jacket, declaring that it was a $5,000 Armani and that he expected full compensation. Jamal sat frozen in his seat, the blood draining from his face. $5,000 was more money than he had ever seen in his life. It was almost 3 months of his mother's salary. Diana gently explained that airline policy did not cover dry cleaning costs for accidental spills, but she would be happy to provide Gregory with a customer service form to submit a claim after the flight. Gregory's response was a stream of increasingly hostile complaints. He accused Jamal of being reckless and disrespectful, suggested that boys like him should not be allowed to fly without adult supervision, and implied that the entire incident was somehow deliberate. Barbara finally spoke up, her voice timid but insistent. She pointed out that it was just an accident and that the turbulence had shaken everyone. Gregory rounded on her with a glare that could have curdled milk, asking if she was really defending him, gesturing contemptuously at Jamal. Barbara shrank back in her seat, properly intimidated, and said nothing more. The immediate crisis eventually subsided when Diana diplomatically offered Gregory a complimentary drink upgrade and extra snacks as a gesture of goodwill. He accepted with poor grace, muttering that it was the least they could do, and returned to his newspaper with aggressive rustling of pages. But the tension in row 24 had ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level. Over the next hour, Gregory found new ways to make Jamal's life miserable. He complained to Diana 3 more times, each complaint more absurd than the last. First he claimed that Jamal was fidgeting too much and disturbing his concentration. Then he asserted that Jamal was playing his music too loudly through his earbuds, even though Jamal had the volume so low he could barely hear it himself. Finally, and most outrageously, he suggested that Jamal had an unpleasant body odor and requested that something be done about it. Diana handled each complaint with diplomatic grace, checking on Jamal each time and finding nothing wrong. She could see what was happening. Gregory Whitmore was harassing a child for no reason other than the color of his skin. But airline policy required her to take passenger complaints seriously, and Gregory was clearly the type who would file formal grievances if he felt his concerns were being dismissed. After the 3rd complaint, Gregory escalated further. He demanded that Diana search Jamal's bag, claiming that the boy had been acting suspiciously and might be carrying something illegal. This time, Diana pushed back more firmly. She explained that she could not search a passenger's belongings without reasonable cause, and there was nothing in Jamal's behavior that warranted such an intrusion. Gregory's face contorted with rage. He threatened to sue the airline, to call his lawyer, to make sure everyone involved in this flight lost their jobs. He was a powerful man, he declared, a businessman with connections, and he would not be treated this way. Through all of this, Jamal sat quietly in his seat, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed forward. Inside, he was a storm of emotions. Humiliation burned in his cheeks. Fear knotted his stomach. Anger simmered beneath the surface, a righteous fury at the injustice of being targeted simply for existing in a space where a man like Gregory Whitmore had decided he did not belong. But overriding all of these feelings was his mother's voice in his head, reminding him to stay calm, not to react, not to give anyone a reason. He thought about his grandfather, beaten for drinking from the wrong water fountain. He thought about all the black men and boys who had been hurt or killed for far less than what was happening on this plane. He thought about Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin and so many others whose names had become synonymous with the ongoing tragedy of American racism. And he vowed silently that he would not become another statistic, another headline, another hashtag. Barbara, to her limited credit, whispered an apology to Jamal when Gregory was distracted by a phone call. She said she was sorry about that man's behavior and that it was not right. Jamal nodded and thanked her, but the words felt hollow. Sorry did not stop what was happening. Sorry did not protect him from the next complaint, the next insult, the next humiliation. Only action could do that, and Barbara was clearly not willing to take action. Jamal retreated into his music, turning up the volume on his favorite violin concerto just enough to drown out Gregory's occasional muttered comments. He closed his eyes and imagined himself on a concert stage, playing to a crowd of thousands, far away from cramped airplane seats and bigoted businessmen. In his mind, he was somebody. In his mind, the color of his skin was irrelevant, only his talent mattered. It was a fantasy, perhaps, but it was the only escape he had. The plane had been in the air for 2 hours now. 3 more hours until Seattle. 3 more hours of this torture. Jamal did not know if he could endure it, but he knew he had to try. For his mother. For his father. For himself. Little did he know that the worst was yet to come, and that before this flight landed, he would face a test greater than anything he had ever imagined. The cabin lights had been dimmed for the remainder of the flight, creating an artificial twilight that made some passengers drowsy. Barbara had reclined her seat and fallen into an uneasy sleep, her reading glasses still perched on her nose. Gregory had finished his scotch and was working on his second, his newspaper discarded on the floor by his feet. Jamal had kept his eyes closed for the past hour, not sleeping but resting, trying to conserve his emotional energy for whatever came next. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed on, accompanied by the captain's voice announcing that they were entering an area of potential turbulence and asking all passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Jamal had kept his belt fastened throughout the flight, but he felt the familiar pressure in his bladder that signaled an urgent need to use the restroom. He had been avoiding the trip, not wanting to climb over Gregory, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. He waited a few minutes, hoping the turbulence would pass quickly. But the plane continued to shake and shimmy, and the captain made no announcement about the seatbelt sign being turned off. Jamal made a decision. He would rather face Gregory's wrath than have an embarrassing accident. He turned to Barbara and gently touched her arm to wake her, asking if she could please let him out to use the restroom. Barbara stirred groggily and nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping into the aisle. But before Jamal could follow, Gregory shifted suddenly, blocking his path. Jamal said "Excuse me sir," explaining that he needed to get by. Gregory looked at him with an expression of utter contempt but said nothing, making no move to facilitate Jamal's exit. Jamal tried to squeeze past, turning sideways to minimize contact. But at that precise moment, the plane hit a particularly strong pocket of turbulence. The aircraft dropped suddenly, then lurched to the right. Jamal, caught off balance in the narrow space between seats, stumbled forward. His hand shot out instinctively to brace himself, and it landed squarely on Gregory's shoulder. The reaction was immediate and violent. Gregory exploded out of his seat, shoving Jamal backward with tremendous force. Jamal crashed into the seat behind him, his hip striking the armrest painfully. Before he could recover, Gregory was on him, grabbing the front of his shirt and shouting accusations that made no sense. He called Jamal a pickpocket and a thief, accusing him of trying to steal his wallet. Jamal tried to protest, tried to explain that he had simply lost his balance. But Gregory was not listening. His face was twisted with rage, veins bulging at his temples, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed. He slapped Jamal across the face with an open palm, the crack of skin against skin shockingly loud in the confined space. Jamal's head snapped to the side. His cheek exploded with pain. He tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue. But before he could even process what had happened, Gregory struck again. This time it was a closed fist, aimed at Jamal's face. The punch connected with his nose, and Jamal felt something crunch. Blood began to pour from his nostrils, dripping down his chin and onto his clean blue shirt. The cabin erupted into chaos. Barbara screamed, pressing herself against the window to get away from the violence. Other passengers shouted for someone to do something. A baby started wailing. The plane shuddered through another patch of turbulence as if the aircraft itself was recoiling from the horror unfolding inside it. But Gregory was not finished. He grabbed Jamal's collar and shook him violently, still shouting about the imaginary theft. Jamal's head snapped back and forth like a rag doll. He tried to raise his arms to protect himself, but Gregory was bigger, stronger, driven by a fury that seemed to have been building long before this flight. From 3 rows back, Marcus Williams had been watching the situation develop with growing alarm. Marcus was 35 years old, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he recognized the signs of a dangerous situation escalating out of control. When he saw Gregory punch a child in the face, something inside him snapped. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed past the stunned passengers in his row, and launched himself toward the altercation. Marcus reached Gregory just as the older man was drawing back for another blow. He grabbed Gregory's arm and twisted it behind his back in a restraint hold he had learned in the military. Gregory howled in pain and outrage, demanding to know who Marcus thought he was. Marcus identified himself as a United States Army veteran and told Gregory to stop assaulting a minor or he would put him on the ground. Gregory struggled against the hold, still sputtering about theft and self-defense. But Marcus was younger, stronger, and highly trained. He forced Gregory to his knees in the aisle, holding him there despite his thrashing protests. Diana appeared with zip-tie restraints from the emergency kit, and together they secured Gregory's wrists behind his back. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. 200 passengers stared at the scene before them, a well-dressed white businessman on his knees in the aisle, restrained like a criminal, and a black teenager slumped against the bulkhead, his face covered in blood. The contrast was stark and terrible, a visual representation of everything wrong with America's racial divide. Dr. Evelyn Thornton, a physician who had been seated several rows forward, pushed through the crowd of onlookers. She knelt beside Jamal and began examining his injuries with gentle, practiced hands. She asked him his name and if he knew where he was, checking for signs of concussion. Jamal answered weakly, blood still dripping from his nose and a bruise already forming on his cheek. Gregory continued to shout from his position on the floor. He insisted that this was self-defense, that the boy had attacked him first, that he was the victim here. But his words rang hollow against the evidence of Jamal's battered face and the testimony of dozens of witnesses who had seen exactly what happened. Now I need to ask you something important. If you believe that no child should ever be treated this way regardless of their skin color, comment the number 1 below. If you think Gregory Whitmore should face the full consequences of his actions, hit that like button right now. And if you want to see justice served in this story, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. The question now is, what happens when the captain of this flight learns what has occurred in his cabin? What will he do when he discovers that the boy bleeding on his aircraft was attacked for no reason other than the color of his skin? The answer is coming, and it is not what anyone expected. Diana Prescott grabbed the intercom phone near the service galley and pressed the button to connect with the flight deck. Her voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she reported to the captain that they had a serious situation in the main cabin. She explained that a passenger had violently assaulted a minor and that the attacker was currently restrained but still combative. She requested the captain's presence immediately. In the cockpit, Captain Raymond Mitchell absorbed the information with the calm demeanor of a man who had faced crises before. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 25 years, ever since he left the United States Air Force where he had piloted F-16 fighter jets. He had dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and even the aftermath of September 11th. But the assault of a child on his aircraft struck a particular chord in his soul. Raymond was a black man in a profession where black faces were still relatively rare. He had worked twice as hard as his white colleagues to earn his captain's stripes, had endured subtle discrimination and overt skepticism throughout his career. He knew what it was like to be judged by the color of his skin before his qualifications were even considered. And the thought of a black child being beaten on his plane ignited a fury that he kept carefully controlled beneath his professional exterior. He informed his co-pilot, a younger white man named Stephen, that he was going to assess the situation in the cabin. Stephen nodded and confirmed that he had control of the aircraft. Raymond removed his captain's jacket, wanting to observe the scene without immediately revealing his authority, and stepped through the cockpit door into the forward galley. He made his way down the aisle, his height giving him a clear view over the seated passengers. What he saw made his blood run cold. A teenage boy sat on the floor against the bulkhead, his face bloody and bruised, a female doctor kneeling beside him. A large black man stood guard over a white businessman who was restrained on his knees, still thrashing and protesting. And 200 passengers watched in shocked silence, some filming on their phones, others simply staring in disbelief. Raymond approached the scene with measured steps. He asked what happened here, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. Diana quickly summarized the situation, explaining that the restrained man, Gregory Whitmore, had repeatedly harassed and then violently assaulted the minor, Jamal Carter, and that multiple witnesses could confirm that Mr. Carter did nothing to provoke the attack. Gregory saw a tall black man in a white pilot's shirt and immediately assumed he was a crew member of lower rank. He demanded that Raymond get him out of these restraints immediately, insisting that he was a victim here and that the boy had tried to rob him. He threatened to have everyone responsible for his treatment fired and sued. Raymond asked for clarification about what exactly the boy was supposed to have stolen. Gregory sputtered that he did not have specifics, but the boy had bumped into him deliberately, it was obviously an attempted theft. Raymond then asked if anything was actually missing from Gregory's person. Gregory paused, patted his pockets as well as he could with restrained hands, and admitted that nothing seemed to be missing, but that was only because he had stopped the theft in progress. Raymond turned to the witnesses. He asked Barbara, who was still pale and shaken in her seat, to describe what she had seen. Barbara's voice trembled as she explained that the plane hit turbulence and the boy lost his balance, that it was clearly an accident, and that Mr. Whitmore just attacked him for no reason. Raymond asked if she saw the boy attempt to steal anything. Barbara shook her head emphatically and said absolutely not. Raymond asked the same questions of Dr. Thornton, of Marcus, and of several other passengers who had witnessed the assault. Every single account confirmed the same story. Jamal had stumbled due to turbulence, Gregory had attacked him without provocation, and the entire incident was rooted in Gregory's apparent hatred of a child he had been tormenting for the entire flight. Gregory grew increasingly agitated as witness after witness contradicted his version of events. He changed tactics, claiming that even if the boy had not actually stolen anything, he had felt threatened by the boy's proximity and aggressive body language. Raymond asked what specifically was threatening about a 130-pound teenager losing his balance during turbulence. Gregory had no coherent answer. Raymond had heard enough. He walked back to the forward galley and retrieved his captain's jacket from where he had left it. He put it on slowly, deliberately, buttoning each of the 4 brass buttons one at a time. Then he turned and walked back to where Gregory knelt on the floor. Gregory looked up as Raymond approached, his eyes traveling from the polished shoes to the crisp uniform pants to the 4 gold stripes on each shoulder that designated a captain's rank. The color drained from his face as the reality of the situation became clear. The tall black man he had been ordering around was not a subordinate to be commanded. He was the highest authority on this aircraft. Raymond introduced himself formally. He stated that he was Captain Raymond Mitchell, and that Gregory had just committed aggravated assault on a minor passenger aboard his aircraft. He explained that under federal aviation regulations, the captain of an aircraft has complete authority over all persons on board during flight. He informed Gregory that he was exercising that authority to place him under restraint for the remainder of the flight, and that upon landing, he would be transferred to the custody of federal law enforcement officers. Gregory began to protest again, but Raymond cut him off with a raised hand. He stated that Gregory's behavior throughout this flight had been witnessed by passengers and crew alike, and that the physical assault of a child was documented by multiple witnesses and likely recorded on passenger cell phones. He advised Gregory to remain silent and consult an attorney after they landed. Diana and another flight attendant helped Gregory to his feet and escorted him to an empty row of seats at the very back of the aircraft, as far from Jamal as possible. They secured him in a seat with additional restraints and informed him that any further disturbance would result in additional charges upon landing. Meanwhile, Dr. Thornton continued to treat Jamal's injuries. She determined that his nose was likely not broken, though it was badly bruised and swollen. The cut on his lip would heal on its own. Her bigger concern was the potential for concussion from the violent shaking he had endured. She recommended that he be examined at a hospital as soon as possible after landing. Marcus sat down next to Jamal, offering quiet reassurance. He told Jamal that he did good, that he stayed calm, and that there was nothing more he could have done. Jamal nodded weakly, the adrenaline fading and leaving him exhausted and overwhelmed. Tears he had been holding back began to slip down his cheeks, mixing with the drying blood on his face. But the drama of Flight 1247 was not yet complete. Even as the captain returned to the cockpit to make arrangements for an emergency landing, a figure was moving through the first-class cabin toward the commotion in coach. A figure whose presence would elevate this incident from a simple assault case to national news. The curtain separating first class from economy rippled, and a distinguished-looking white man in his 60s stepped through into the main cabin. He had silver hair swept back from a high forehead, sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention simply by entering a room. He wore a navy blue suit of impeccable cut and a subtle American flag pin on his lapel that identified him to those who recognized such symbols as a member of Congress. This was Senator Franklin Hayes, the senior senator from Virginia and one of the most influential members of the United States Senate. He served on the Judiciary Committee, the Commerce Committee, and the Powerful Appropriations Committee. He had been in Congress for 30 years and had survived enough political battles to know exactly how to wield power. And for the past 2 hours, he had been watching the events in row 24 unfold on the overhead camera feed that he had requested access to through a flight attendant who recognized him. Raymond noticed the senator's approach and recognized him immediately from news broadcasts. He straightened instinctively, the military training still ingrained after all these years. Senator Hayes nodded to the captain with a familiarity that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with uniformed authority figures. Senator Hayes explained that he had been watching from first class, not everything, but enough. He stated that he understood there was a young man who was assaulted by another passenger. His eyes scanned the cabin until they landed on Jamal, still sitting on the floor with Dr. Thornton, his face swollen and streaked with blood and tears. The senator's expression shifted. Something softened behind those sharp blue eyes as he looked at the battered teenager. He crossed the cabin with purpose and lowered himself to one knee beside Jamal, putting himself at eye level with the boy. He asked what Jamal's name was. Jamal looked up at the well-dressed stranger, unsure of who he was or why he was kneeling on an airplane floor in what was obviously an expensive suit. He said his name was Jamal Carter, sir. The senator nodded and introduced himself as Frank Hayes, saying he was a United States Senator. He said he had seen what happened to Jamal, at least part of it, and he wanted Jamal to know that what that man did was wrong and that there would be consequences. Gregory, who was now secured at the back of the plane but within earshot, recognized the senator's name and face. His already pale complexion turned ghostly white. He and Senator Hayes moved in overlapping circles of power in Washington. Gregory's company had been a major contractor on several federal projects, and he had crossed paths with the senator at numerous political fundraisers. More importantly, Gregory knew that Senator Hayes had once declined to support his company's bid for a lucrative government contract, citing concerns about the company's labor practices. Senator Hayes stood and turned to face the back of the plane where Gregory sat. He walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately, letting the tension build with each step. When he reached Gregory's row, he stopped and looked down at the restrained businessman with an expression of cold contempt. He told Gregory that they had met before, several times actually, at various events in Washington. He reminded Gregory that about 3 years ago, Gregory's company had bid on a contract to build federal housing units in Virginia. He said he had done some research at that time into Gregory's company and had found some things that gave him pause. He mentioned multiple complaints of discriminatory hiring practices, a pattern of paying black and Hispanic workers less than their white counterparts for the same work, a hostile work environment that drove away employees who were not white males. He said those were the reasons he had declined to support the bid. Gregory began to sputter a defense, but Senator Hayes continued. He observed that watching Gregory's behavior on this flight confirmed everything he had suspected 3 years ago. He stated that Gregory was not just a bad businessman, but a man who carried hatred in his heart, a man who would beat a child for the crime of occupying space near him. The senator turned to address the other passengers, his voice rising to carry throughout the cabin. He stated that what they had witnessed on this flight was not an isolated incident, not a misunderstanding, not a matter of he said she said. He declared it was a hate crime, committed against a child, in front of 200 witnesses. He pledged that as a United States Senator, he would do everything in his power to ensure that the perpetrator faced the full consequences of the law. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers who had been too shocked or scared to intervene now found their voices, shouting their agreement, thanking the senator for speaking up. Even the flight attendants, trained to remain neutral, allowed small smiles to cross their faces. But Senator Hayes was not finished. He explained to the passengers that he had recently begun drafting legislation to strengthen protections against hate crimes on public transportation, including airlines. He acknowledged that the events of this flight were tragic, but suggested that perhaps some good could come from them. He expressed his hope that Jamal's ordeal would be the catalyst for change that would protect other children, other families, other innocent people from experiencing what Jamal had experienced. Captain Mitchell announced over the intercom that the aircraft would be diverting to Denver International Airport for an emergency landing. Federal law enforcement officers would be waiting to take custody of the restrained passenger. All other passengers would be rebooked on connecting flights to their final destinations. As the plane began its descent, Senator Hayes returned to Jamal's side. He asked if Jamal had family he could call, someone who should know what had happened. Jamal nodded and said his mother was in Atlanta and his father was supposed to meet him in Seattle. The senator offered his personal cell phone and told Jamal to call them both, and that the calls would be on him. Jamal took the phone with trembling hands. He dialed his mother's number first, and when Lorraine answered, he could not hold back the tears any longer. Through sobs, he told her what had happened. He could hear her crying on the other end of the line, could hear her asking questions he could barely process, could hear the fear and fury in her voice as she promised to get to him as soon as humanly possible. When he hung up, Jamal looked out the window at the Rocky Mountains growing larger beneath the plane. In the reflection, he saw his battered face staring back at him. He looked different somehow. Older. Harder. As if some part of his childhood had been beaten out of him along with the blood from his nose. But he also felt something else, something unexpected. He felt seen. For the first time in his life, powerful people were standing up for him. A captain, a senator, a cabin full of witnesses who would not let his suffering be swept under the rug. It did not erase the pain or the fear. But it gave him something he had been struggling to hold onto throughout this nightmare, hope. The wheels of Delta Flight 1247 touched down on the runway of Denver International Airport with a gentle thump that belied the turbulence of the preceding hours. The aircraft taxied to a remote gate where a phalanx of law enforcement vehicles waited, their red and blue lights creating a kaleidoscope of color against the gray Colorado afternoon. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. He informed the passengers that they had arrived at Denver International Airport, where they would be deplaning shortly. He explained that law enforcement officers would be boarding to remove the passenger who had been restrained, and asked everyone to remain seated until that process was complete. He thanked them for their patience and cooperation during a very difficult flight. The forward door opened, and a team of 4 FBI agents in tactical vests entered the aircraft. They were accompanied by 2 Denver police officers and a representative from the Transportation Security Administration. The lead FBI agent, a serious-looking woman with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, approached Captain Mitchell for a briefing. He directed her to the back of the plane where Gregory Whitmore sat seething in his restraints. The agents made their way down the aisle, passing rows of passengers who watched in silent satisfaction. When they reached Gregory, they identified themselves and informed him that he was being taken into federal custody on suspicion of assault of a minor, and commission of a hate crime on an aircraft. Gregory protested loudly that this was all a misunderstanding, that he was a respected businessman, that he wanted to speak to his lawyer immediately. The agents ignored his protests. They cut the zip tie restraints that Diana had applied, immediately replacing them with proper handcuffs. They read Gregory his rights in a clear, methodical voice that carried throughout the cabin. Then they lifted him from his seat and began walking him toward the front of the plane. As Gregory was led past the other passengers, something remarkable happened. A woman in row 15 began to clap. A man in row 8 joined in. Within seconds, the entire cabin had erupted in applause and cheers. Passengers who had been too afraid to intervene during the assault now found the courage to express their feelings. Some shouted words of condemnation at Gregory. Others simply clapped and nodded with grim satisfaction. Gregory's face cycled through expressions of rage, humiliation, and finally something that might have been fear as the reality of his situation set in. He was not going to buy his way out of this one. He was not going to use his connections to make it disappear. He had committed a violent act in front of 200 witnesses, many of whom had recorded it on their phones. His life as he knew it was over. The agents led him off the plane and down the jetway where a crowd of reporters and photographers had already gathered. Word of the incident had spread through social media during the flight, with passengers texting and posting updates whenever the plane's Wi-Fi had allowed. By the time Gregory emerged from the aircraft, he was already famous, but not in the way he had ever imagined. Camera flashes exploded in his face. Reporters shouted questions about whether he felt remorse, whether he had anything to say for himself, whether he understood the gravity of what he had done. Gregory kept his head down and said nothing as the agents pushed through the media scrum and loaded him into a waiting SUV. Meanwhile, paramedics had boarded the aircraft to attend to Jamal. They placed him on a stretcher despite his insistence that he could walk, explaining that it was standard procedure for any assault victim. As they carried him up the aisle, passengers reached out to touch his hand, to offer words of encouragement, to tell him how brave he was. An elderly black woman with tears streaming down her face told him that he was going to be all right, that God had a plan for him. A young white father held up his toddler son and told the child to look at the brave young man. Dr. Thornton accompanied Jamal to the ambulance, providing the paramedics with a detailed account of his injuries and the treatment she had administered during the flight. She promised to make herself available as a witness for any legal proceedings and gave Jamal her personal contact information, telling him to call if he ever needed anything. The ambulance transported Jamal to Denver Health Medical Center, where he was immediately taken into the emergency department for a thorough examination. X-rays confirmed that his nose was not broken, though it was badly contused. He was diagnosed with a mild concussion and instructed to rest for the next several days. His other injuries were superficial and would heal on their own within a week or two. While Jamal was being examined, the story of Flight 1247 was exploding across the internet. Multiple passengers had uploaded their videos of the assault to social media platforms, and the clips were going viral at an unprecedented rate. Within 3 hours, the hashtag Justice for Jamal was trending nationally. Within 6 hours, it was trending globally. News networks interrupted their regular programming to cover the story. Commentators debated the implications of the assault, the response of the airline, the role of the senator who had intervened. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the attack and calling for federal hate crime charges. Gregory Whitmore's company saw its stock price plummet as investors fled in anticipation of the coming scandal. Lorraine Carter arrived at Denver Health Medical Center 8 hours after the assault, having caught the first available flight from Atlanta. She burst through the emergency room doors like a woman possessed, demanding to see her son. A nurse led her to Jamal's bedside, where he was resting with an ice pack on his swollen nose. Mother and son embraced with a desperation born of fear and relief and love. Lorraine held Jamal's face in her hands, examining every cut and bruise, tears streaming down her cheeks. She apologized over and over, saying she was so sorry, she should never have let him go alone. Jamal assured her through his own tears that it was not her fault, that none of this was her fault, that the fault belonged to people like the man who had attacked him. A few hours later, another visitor arrived. Derek Carter had caught a flight from Seattle the moment he learned what had happened to his son. He appeared in the doorway of Jamal's hospital room, a tall man with graying temples and eyes that reflected deep shame and regret. For a long moment, the three members of the Carter family looked at each other in silence. Then Derek spoke, his voice cracking as he said he was sorry, that he was so sorry for everything. It was not the reunion any of them had imagined. But as the night deepened and the three of them sat together in that hospital room, something shifted. The walls that had separated them for 10 years began, slowly and tentatively, to come down. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of the medical center at night. Lorraine sat in a chair beside Jamal's bed, her hand wrapped protectively around his. Derek stood by the window, looking out at the city lights of Denver, unable to meet the eyes of the family he had abandoned so long ago. The silence was heavy with a decade of unspoken words, unanswered questions, and wounds that had never properly healed. Finally, Jamal spoke. He asked his father why he had left, why he never called, why he had let 10 years pass without a single word to his only child. Derek turned from the window, and in the dim light, Jamal could see that his father's cheeks were wet with tears. Derek began to speak, slowly at first, then with increasing anguish as the words he had held inside for so long finally poured out. He explained that 10 years ago, he had been working as a mechanical engineer for a construction company, a good job with good benefits that he had thought would provide for his family for years to come. The company had been owned by a man named Gregory Whitmore. Derek paused to let the name sink in, watching as recognition dawned on the faces of his wife and son. He continued, explaining that he was one of only 3 black engineers at the company. He had worked harder than anyone, put in longer hours, taken on extra projects. But no matter what he did, he was always passed over for promotions in favor of white colleagues with less experience and lower qualifications. When he complained to human resources, nothing changed. When he complained again, he started to notice a shift in how he was treated, exclusion from meetings, vague criticisms of his work, a general sense that he was being pushed out. Then came the day that destroyed everything. A major project Derek had been working on failed its safety inspection. He had not been responsible for the failure. In fact, he had flagged the issue months earlier and been ignored. But when the company needed a scapegoat, they chose him. A white colleague whom Derek had considered a friend testified that Derek had cut corners and ignored protocols. Derek was fired for gross negligence. His reputation in the industry was destroyed overnight. He sank into a deep depression, Derek continued. He could not find work. He felt like a failure, like he had let his family down. And when the darkness got too heavy, when he started thinking thoughts that scared him, he made a decision. He left. He told himself it was to protect Lorraine and Jamal from his self-destruction. He told himself they would be better off without him. He acknowledged that it was the wrong decision, the cowardly decision. He should have gotten help. He should have fought through it. He should have been there for his son. He said there was no excuse for what he had done, but he wanted Jamal to know that he had not left because he did not love him. He left because he loved him too much to let him watch his father fall apart. The room was silent again as Lorraine and Jamal processed this revelation. Lorraine was the first to speak. She asked if Derek was saying that the man who attacked Jamal on that plane was the same man who had destroyed Derek's career and broken up their family. Derek nodded, his face a mask of anguish. Jamal felt something shift inside him. The coincidence was so profound, so unlikely, that it felt almost like fate. The man who had beaten him bloody 35,000 feet in the air was the same man who had taken his father away when he was 4 years old. Gregory Whitmore had cast a shadow over the Carter family for a decade, and now, in the most unexpected of circumstances, that shadow was finally being exposed to light. An FBI agent knocked on the door and entered the room. She introduced herself as Special Agent Patricia Coleman and explained that she was leading the investigation into the assault on Jamal. She had some questions for the family, she said, and also some information that might be relevant to their case. Agent Coleman explained that in the course of their investigation, they had discovered that Gregory Whitmore had a long history of racially motivated behavior. Multiple former employees had come forward in the hours since the assault became public, sharing their own stories of discrimination and harassment at his company. At least 3 of these former employees were prepared to testify that they had been wrongfully terminated after raising concerns about racial discrimination. She then asked if Derek Carter had ever worked for Whitmore Construction. Derek confirmed that he had and that he had been fired under false pretenses 10 years ago. Agent Coleman nodded and said that Derek's case matched the pattern they were seeing. She explained that federal prosecutors were considering adding additional charges related to a pattern of racial discrimination at Whitmore's company. The implications were staggering. Gregory Whitmore was not going to face justice just for the assault on Jamal. He was going to face justice for a decade of racism, discrimination, and the destruction of lives like Derek's. The man who had thought he was above the law was about to learn that his wealth and connections could not protect him from the consequences of his hatred. After Agent Coleman left, the Carter family sat in stunned silence. Then Jamal spoke, his voice stronger than it had been all day. He said that Gregory Whitmore had taken his father away from him once. He was not going to let him take anything else. He was going to testify at whatever trial happened. He was going to stand up in court and tell the world what that man had done. And when it was over, when Whitmore was in prison where he belonged, the Carter family was going to heal. Together. Lorraine looked at her son with new eyes. The boy who had boarded that plane in Atlanta was gone. In his place was a young man, tempered by pain and hardship, but stronger for it. She took Jamal's hand in one of hers and Derek's hand in the other. For the first time in 10 years, the Carter family was whole again. Broken, bruised, but whole. They did not know what the future held. There would be trials and testimony, media attention and public scrutiny. There would be difficult conversations about the past and uncertain steps toward reconciliation. But for now, in that quiet hospital room, they had each other. And that was enough. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight, and the world had changed for the Carter family. The trial of Gregory Whitmore had become a national sensation, covered extensively by every major news outlet in the country. Prosecutor after prosecutor had paraded witnesses before the jury, building a devastating case against a man who had spent his entire life believing that his wealth made him untouchable. Jamal had taken the stand on the third day of the trial. He had walked into the courtroom wearing a suit that Senator Hayes had personally purchased for him, his head held high despite the nervous trembling of his hands. He had looked Gregory Whitmore in the eye and described in clear, steady terms exactly what had happened on Flight 1247. He had not faltered when the defense attorney tried to twist his words. He had not wavered when Gregory glared at him with undisguised hatred. He had spoken his truth, and the jury had believed him. Gregory Whitmore was convicted on all counts: assault of a minor, commission of a hate crime, assault with intent to cause bodily harm, and interfering with a flight crew. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and no tolerance for the defendant's theatrics, sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $2 million in restitution to the Carter family. Additional civil suits from former employees of his company were pending, and legal experts predicted that Whitmore would be in court for years to come. The Carter family had not kept the money for themselves. After covering Jamal's medical expenses and setting aside a modest amount for his college education, they had donated the rest to the newly established Carter Foundation for Racial Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal assistance to victims of discrimination and hate crimes. Senator Franklin Hayes had made good on his promise. 3 months after the assault, he introduced the Jamal Carter Civil Rights Protection Act to the United States Senate. The legislation would strengthen penalties for hate crimes committed on public transportation, mandate anti-bias training for airline employees, and establish a federal fund to provide support services to victims of racially motivated violence. The bill passed the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support and was currently awaiting consideration in the House of Representatives. Captain Raymond Mitchell had become a mentor and father figure to Jamal. The two met regularly for lunch, and Raymond had taken it upon himself to ensure that Jamal had the opportunities that his talent deserved. When he learned that Jamal was entirely self-taught on the violin, he connected him with a friend who was a professor at the Juilliard School. That connection led to an audition, which led to a full scholarship offer. In the fall, Jamal would be moving to New York City to study at one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the world. Derek and Lorraine had not reconciled as a couple. The wounds of the past were too deep, the years apart too many. But they had found a way to coexist as co-parents, united in their love for their son and their commitment to his future. Derek had started therapy to address the depression that had plagued him for so long. Lorraine had forgiven him, not immediately and not easily, but eventually. They were not a traditional family anymore, but they were a family nonetheless. And Jamal himself had been transformed. The shy, uncertain boy who had boarded that plane in Atlanta had been replaced by a confident young man with a voice and a platform. He had been invited to speak at schools and community centers across the country, sharing his story and encouraging young people to stand up against racism wherever they found it. He had been featured in magazines and newspapers, on television programs and podcasts. He had become, almost despite himself, a symbol of resilience and hope. But for all the public attention, Jamal's greatest triumph came in private. 1 year after the assault, on the anniversary of the day that had changed his life, he stepped onto the stage of Carnegie Hall in New York City. The concert was a benefit for the Carter Foundation, and the house was packed with supporters, including his mother, his father, Captain Mitchell, Senator Hayes, Barbara Simmons, Marcus Williams, and Dr. Evelyn Thornton, all the people who had stood by him on the worst day of his life and helped him find his way to this moment. Before he raised his violin, Jamal spoke briefly to the audience. He said that exactly 1 year ago, he was beaten on an airplane for no reason other than the color of his skin. He explained that the man who attacked him tried to take away his dignity, his sense of safety, and his belief that the world could be a just place. He acknowledged that for a while, it worked, and he was scared and angry and lost. But then, Jamal continued, something amazing happened. People stood up for him. Complete strangers refused to let injustice go unchallenged. A pilot, a senator, a soldier, a doctor, an elementary school teacher, and hundreds of others raised their voices and said that what happened to him was wrong and that they would not let it stand. He said that it was those people who gave him the courage to keep going. He explained that the piece he was about to play was dedicated to all of them, to everyone who has ever been knocked down because of who they are, and to everyone who has helped pick them back up. He said that they can be beaten, but they will never be defeated. He raised his violin and began to play. The music that filled Carnegie Hall was unlike anything anyone had ever heard from him before. It was mournful and triumphant, angry and hopeful, a musical journey through pain and into healing. Tears streamed down the faces of listeners as the melody soared and dipped, carrying them along on a tide of pure emotion. When the last note faded into silence, the audience rose as one in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Jamal stood on that stage, his eyes closed, letting the applause wash over him. He thought about his mother, who had sacrificed everything to give him a chance. He thought about his father, who had lost himself and then found his way back. He thought about the man who had beaten him, now sitting in a prison cell, his empire in ruins, his legacy forever tainted. And he smiled. Because he had won. Not with fists or with hatred, but with music and with love and with the simple refusal to let injustice have the final word. Now I want to ask you something important. What would you do if you witnessed someone being attacked because of their race or background? Would you have the courage to stand up like Marcus did, like Captain Mitchell did, like Senator Hayes did? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button to help more people see it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more stories of courage, resilience, and justice. And share this video with someone who needs to hear Jamal's message today. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. May you always have the strength to stand up for what is right, and may you always find people who will stand beside you when the world tries to knock you down. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never forget that your voice matters. Jamal's journey teaches us profound truths that resonate far beyond a single flight. First, racism is not just about hateful words. It manifests in suspicious glances, unfair treatment, and the assumption that someone is dangerous simply because of their skin color. Gregory Whitmore did not wear a hood or carry a sign. He wore an expensive suit and sat in a plain seat, yet his hatred was just as destructive. Second, silence is complicity. Barbara felt uncomfortable with Gregory's behavior but said nothing until it was too late. When we witness injustice and remain silent, we become part of the problem. It takes courage to speak up, but that courage can save lives. Third, true strength is not about fighting back with fists. Jamal won his battle through dignity, resilience, and the refusal to let hatred define his future. He transformed his trauma into purpose, his pain into music, his victimhood into advocacy. Fourth, healing is possible when people come together. The Carter family was broken for 10 years, but through this tragedy, they found their way back to each other. Sometimes our darkest moments become the catalyst for our greatest transformations. Finally, justice delayed is not justice denied. Gregory Whitmore escaped consequences for years, but eventually, the truth caught up with him. No amount of money or power can protect hatred forever. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of their race? What did you do, or what do you wish you had done? Share your experience in the comments below, because your story might inspire someone else to take action. If Jamal's courage moved you today, please hit that like button and help this message reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story of resilience and justice. And most importantly, share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone who believes that every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of the color of their skin. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching until the very end. Your presence here means everything. May you always find the strength to stand up against injustice, may you always have allies who will stand beside you, and may you never forget that one voice, your voice, can change the world. Stay strong, stay kind, and keep believing in the power of justice.